When an arrogant billionaire mocked a quiet janitor, daring him to play the piano in front of a glittering crowd, she thought it was just a cruel joke. But when his fingers touched the keys, the entire hall fell silent, and what happened next would change every life in that room forever. The old piano sat in the corner of the community center, its wood faded and its keys chipped from years of eager, clumsy fingers pressing melodies into the air. Children had grown up learning their first scales on it. Teenagers had practiced late into the night, hoping to turn practice into passion. And yet now, the instrument rested in silence, ignored, almost forgotten. It was a cold spring morning when Ava walked into the room. She wasn't looking for music, she was looking for peace. Her world had felt heavy lately, weighed down by unanswered questions and quiet fears she carried alone. But something about that piano pulled her closer. She paused at the doorway, her hands still stuffed in the pockets of her jacket, and just listened. There was no sound. No one was playing, but her heart insisted there was music there, something waiting, something hopeful. Ava stepped forward slowly, her shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor. She sat down on the wooden bench, brushed her fingers against the cold keys, and pressed one note. Just a single note. The sound rang out into the still air, soft and fragile, yet strangely alive. She exhaled, and it felt as though the room exhaled with her. Ava hadn't touched a piano in years. Life had carried her away from things that once made her soul light up. Work obligations, setbacks, they had all stacked themselves on her shoulders. And music had been the first thing to slip away. She told herself she didn't have time for it anymore, didn't have the right to dream. But sitting there, hearing that single note fade into silence, something stirred inside her. Maybe hope wasn't gone. Maybe it had just been quiet, waiting. Her fingers fell again, this time on 2 keys, then 3, then 4. A melody began to form, not practiced, not perfect, but honest. And in that small, almost empty room, Ava began to remember who she was. Unbeknownst to her, someone was watching. Across the hall, Mr. Bennett, the elderly janitor, leaned against his mop handle and listened. His face softened as the notes trickled out. He had spent years keeping the community center clean, fixing squeaky doors, patching leaky roofs. Most people hardly noticed him, but he noticed everything, and he noticed hope when it began to breathe again. He smiled quietly to himself. Someone's finding their way back, he murmured. By the time Ava stopped playing, she was blinking back tears. She wasn't sure why she felt so overwhelmed. It wasn't as if she had played anything extraordinary. It was simple, almost childlike. But in her heart, it was the first time in a long time that something felt alive. And it made her wonder, if one note could stir her this deeply, what might happen if she dared to play more. She closed the piano lid gently, almost reverently, and whispered under her breath, "I'll come back tomorrow." Mr. Bennett, still unseen, whispered back with a grin, "I'll be waiting." This was the beginning not of a perfect life, not of a life without struggle, but of a journey toward hope, toward healing, and toward connection. Ava didn't yet know how much the piano would change her life, or how many lives her playing would touch. She didn't know about the friendships waiting for her, the resilience she would discover, or the beauty she would bring into the lives of others. All she knew was this: after so many silent years, she had found her first note, and sometimes that's enough to begin again. The air inside the Whitmore Grand seemed to tighten as Marcus stepped forward. Every pair of eyes in the glittering hall turned, not toward Victoria's diamonds or the chandeliers, but toward the janitor who had just spoken his name aloud. "My name is Marcus," he had said, simple, steady, undeniable. The sentence still floated in the air like a struck bell. It was more than an introduction. It was a reminder that dignity had no uniform. Victoria's smile stayed fixed, practiced to perfection, but in her chest a flicker of unease pressed against her ribs. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The dare had been a joke, a sharp command to reassert her control after the splash of champagne. But the man was refusing to play the role of a joke. He was choosing something else, something much heavier. Guests whispered as Marcus crossed the floor. His shoes tapped softly against the marble, each step impossibly loud in the hush that followed him. People tilted their heads, phone screens already lifted, waiting to capture the fall they expected. 30 seconds. Someone murmured, "That's all he'll last." Yet, the longer Marcus walked, the more the air shifted. The cameras weren't just hunting spectacle anymore. They were recording a possibility, and that was far more dangerous to the neat little boxes people had drawn around him. Gloria Johnson stood near the edge of the hall, clutching her packet of tissues as if they were a lifeline. She had seen Marcus carry himself like this before, quiet, upright, with a calm that came not from arrogance but from a refusal to shrink. She prayed silently that the music she once overheard him play in empty back rooms would rise tonight. David Chen, the critic, leaned slightly forward, adjusting his glasses. He had heard countless performers step onto stages, some dazzling with technique, some collapsing under the weight of expectation. But this man, this janitor in a navy shirt and black gloves, carried himself differently. There was no showmanship, no bow, no self-advertising grin. Just calm steps. Chun's pen hovered above his notepad. Something was happening here at the foot of the stage. Marcus paused. Two security guards instinctively moved into place, blocking his path. Their posture wasn't hostile, only habitual, the reflex of a system designed to decide who belonged where. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his head toward the left, where a couple laughed as they leaned against the stage for selfies with a piano gleaming in the background. No one stopped them. The contrast was plain. It cut deeper than argument ever could. For a beat, the guards hesitated. Then a low voice, calm but firm, slid across the silence. Let him through. David Chen hadn't raised his voice, but authority hummed in it. The guard stepped aside. The path opened. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Something unplanned was taking place, and unplanned moments had the power to reshape nights like this. Victoria's jaw tightened. She told herself she still had control. The audience would laugh in a minute. The joke would fold neatly into a headline about unexpected entertainment, and the gala would return to its carefully written script. But deep down, somewhere she hadn't visited in years, a question stirred. What if he really can play? She pushed the thought down. Impossible. Marcus stepped onto the riser. For the first time in years, he wasn't folding himself smaller to fit into the edges of a room. He was walking at his full height, carrying nothing but his own name. He reached the Steinway. Its polished black surface reflected the chandelier above, scattering their light into tiny stars. Slowly, reverently, Marcus placed his palm on the lid. The hall fell utterly silent. Even those who had laughed now held their breath. Victoria lifted her chin, her voice cutting the silence like glass. "Well then," she said, "prove it, buddy." The word buddy snapped against the quiet like a whip. Marcus didn't flinch. He removed his gloves, folded them neatly onto the tray beside the stage, and spoke clearly enough for the first row to hear. "My name," he said again, "is Marcus, not Buddy." The sentence landed heavier than before. Then, with a measured breath, he pulled out the bench and sat down. 1,000 tiny expectations hung in the air like threads, waiting to break. Phones angled forward. Guests leaned closer, some prepared to laugh, some to sigh, some to judge. But Marcus wasn't thinking of them. He wasn't thinking of the crowd or the chandelier light or the glittering gowns. He was thinking of his mother's tired smile, of the keys he once practiced on until his fingers went numb, of the silence that had pressed on him for years, and now of the one chance to let music speak where words had never been enough. He lifted the piano lid. The hinge gave a soft click. The room seemed to lean forward. Marcus exhaled, let his shoulders drop, and placed his fingertips gently on the keys. For a moment, nothing moved. The audience balanced on the edge of anticipation. Then, with a touch as soft as dipping into water, Marcus pressed the first note. It rang clear and clean into the golden air, carrying something fragile, something strong, something that felt like truth itself. And in that instant, the entire hall changed color. The first note lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy, it was simple, clean, alive, and somehow it refused to vanish. Marcus held his hands still, letting the sound breathe, letting the sound breathe, letting the silence after it grow heavy enough for people to lean in. Then, with care, he touched a second note, and a third, stringing them together into the opening bars of a melody that had once carried him through summer nights on cracked sidewalks. Summertime. The crowd, at first, didn't recognize it. The tempo was slower than they were used to, the phrasing gentler, more deliberate, but then the notes unfurled, and a ripple of recognition passed through the hall. Only this wasn't the kind of summertime anyone had heard in a lounge or on a radio. This was something stripped bare, something so honest that even the chandeliers seemed to dim themselves to listen. David Chen leaned forward, his critic's ear instantly alert. He knew the piece well, too well. It had been performed 1,000 times, turned into background noise in restaurants, a staple for eager students to prove they could play with soul. Yet in Marcus's hands, it sounded new. Marcus's left hand laid down a foundation soft as footsteps on a hot city sidewalk. His right hand answered sparingly, never rushing, never crowding. He bent a note here, stretched a pause there, shaping the music like clay until it carried the warmth of a summer breeze, the heaviness of long afternoons, the quiet resilience of people who endure. Chun's pen stilled over his notepad. "This is not amateur playing." In the second row, the man who had joked earlier, "Careful, more white keys than black," felt his smirk falter. The rhythm caught him, pulled him in before he realized it. His champagne glass stilled in his hand. He found himself listening, truly listening, and for the first time that night, he had nothing to say. Near the back, a young server carrying a tray froze mid-step. She lowered it carefully onto a side table, her eyes locked on the piano. Her lips trembled into the faintest smile. "And Gloria Johnson?" She pressed a tissue to her face, not to wipe tears but simply to steady herself against the flood of pride. She had known Marcus's quiet dignity for years, but tonight, she was watching it take shape and sound. Victoria sat rigid in her chair. She had prepared herself for laughter, for spectacle, for 30 seconds of embarrassment neatly folded into a viral clip she could later spin. But she hadn't prepared for this. The notes wrapped around her like a question she had no answer for. She remembered, against her will, being 10 years old, her teacher's hand guiding hers on the keys of her childhood piano. Silence is also a note. Young lady, the teacher had said. Victoria had hated that lesson. To her, silence had always meant absence, absence of power, absence of control. But here, Marcus used silence like sunlight. He let it fall where it was needed, warming the notes instead of choking them, and it unsettled her. The laughter that had hovered at the edges of the crowd shrank, dried, and disappeared. In its place came stillness, the kind of stillness that wasn't empty, but full of something that pressed on every chest in the room. Marcus's fingers never rushed. He chose restraint over flash, honesty over display. Each note landed with exactly the weight it needed, no more, no less. It wasn't entertainment, it was truth. David Chen scribbled quickly in his notebook, beautiful touch, deep control, warmth, not through tricks but intent. He underlined the word intent twice. The man had rejected money, rejected spectacle, rejected being treated like a bet, and now his playing reflected the same refusal. Every note was chosen, not for applause, but for meaning. Chen exhaled softly and murmured just loud enough for his own ears. Professional. More than professional. When Marcus reached the bridge, he leaned into the harmony, shading it with a depth that was not dark but rich. He held one note just long enough for people to realize they were waiting for the next, and in that pause, the entire hall transformed. Servers slowed their steps. Security guards lowered their shoulders. Even the PR woman, clipboard in hand, forgot her schedule. The gala with all its rules, all its glass and marble, all its polished edges became something else entirely. It became an audience for the first time in years. Marcus wasn't invisible. He wasn't a shadow moving behind doors or a nameless buddy clearing glasses. He was Marcus Reed, and the room had no choice but to recognize it. The final phrase drifted down gently, not with a flourish, but with the simplicity of returning home. He lifted his fingers, released the pedal, and let the last note fade into silence. But this silence was different, not the awkward silence of spilled champagne, not the empty silence of routine speeches. This was silence that had changed color, warm, present, alive. No one dared break it, not yet. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The final note still seemed to hover in the air, as if the Steinway itself was reluctant to let it go. Marcus sat perfectly still, his hands resting loosely in his lap, eyes lowered but not closed. He wasn't waiting for approval. He wasn't waiting for applause. He was simply being. And somehow that was louder than any ovation. It was a single clap that broke the stillness, sharp, sudden from the back of the hall. It startled the crowd like a knock at a closed door. The clapper froze, realizing what they had done, as though afraid of disturbing something sacred. But then, a second clap joined it, then a third. Then the sound began to spread, hesitant at first, then stronger, until the entire room was moving in unison. Applause filled the grand hall, echoing off marble and glass, not the polite applause of a gala, not the practiced rhythm of people clapping because it was expected. This applause was uneven, raw, human. It came in bursts and waves, rising from the chests of people who didn't know how else to say. We felt that. David Chen clapped slowly, deliberately. His critic's precision, even in the each strike of his palms, was like a seal placed on the performance. He didn't rise, not yet, but he knew. This wasn't a novelty act. This was artistry. He scribbled one final note in his book, at a professional level, no question. In the crowd, a young woman lowered her phone, embarrassed to realize she had stopped recording halfway through. Not because the performance wasn't worth capturing, but because at some point, she had simply forgotten to hold up the camera. That, she thought, was proof enough. Victoria Whitmore sat stiff in her chair, her smile polished to perfection. On the surface, she looked composed, even gracious. But inside, a tremor ran through her. This wasn't how it was meant to unfold. The dare had been meant to humiliate him, a brief spectacle to put the spotlight back where it belonged. Her. Instead, the spotlight had shifted and now it clung stubbornly to him. Worse, she could feel the crowd's eyes drifting toward her. She promised. Those eyes seemed to say, we all heard her. Will she keep her word? Victoria's throat tightened. She forced her jaw to hold the smile. I can still control this. I can still redirect. But for the first time in years, she wasn't sure. Marcus didn't bow, didn't gesture, didn't even acknowledge the applause with anything more than a steady breath. He wasn't here to win their approval. He wasn't here to collect their bets. He was here to speak, and he had spoken. The applause rolled on. Stronger now, some guests rising to their feet, the sound of heels against marble, the rustle of gowns, the clatter of glasses abandoned on tables, all of it swelled into something like thunder. And then, from somewhere in the front row, a voice broke through. Encore heads turned. A murmur spread. Another one. Let him play again. Yes, more. It was no longer just applause. It was demand. Victoria's stomach sank. The night was slipping further out of her grasp. Gloria Johnson's eyes glistened. She whispered under her breath, too soft for anyone to hear but herself. Play for them, Marcus. Let them know. Marcus finally lifted his head, He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply looked across the crowd, his calm gaze cutting through the chaos of claps and shouts. Then he turned to Victoria. Her smile faltered for the first time. The applause still thundered, but beneath it, something deeper was rising, a question that no one dared voice aloud but everyone felt. Would she keep her word? The entire night now balanced on what happened next. The applause slowly faded into an eager hush. Guests leaned forward, phones lifted again, waiting to see whether the janitor-turned-pianist would give them more. Marcus rested his palms lightly on the lid of the Steinway. He didn't rush. He didn't acknowledge the cries of encore with any grand gesture. Instead, he took a slow breath, as though he were listening not to the audience but to the room itself, to the silence that now belonged to him. Then, quietly, he rolled his wrists, adjusted the bench, and set his fingers on the keys. This time, the melody was not the warm sway of summertime. This time, it was discipline. The sonata's opening bars leapt crisp and clear into the air. Not lush, not indulgent, precise. Each note landed with the certainty of a stone placed into a structure. The rhythm of his left hand rolled like clockwork, steady and unshakable. His right hand carved lines above it, delicate yet firm, the two hands weaving in dialogue like gears meshing in perfect timing. The hall, so used to being fed sensations, perfume, champagne, lights, laughter, now found itself counting along with him, as though compelled to join the discipline. David Chen's critic's ear snapped alert. His pen flew across the page. Clear articulation, controlled pedal, rare restraint. He noticed the way Marcus released the damper exactly at phrase endings, never clouding the harmony. The way his fingers carried a line without relying on volume, shaping sound by touch alone. Chen narrowed his eyes, listening more intently than he had all evening. This is not luck. This is training. Years of it. A man in the third row who had studied piano decades ago but given it up after college, tilted his head, his body leaning with the phrases. He recognized the voicing, the precision, the maturity that comes only from years of practice. He whispered to his wife, "This isn't a hobby. He's a real musician." In the back row, a server forgot herself and clasped her hands together, holding them tight against her apron as if the music might spill out of her if she didn't. Even the guards, still flanking the stage, found their posture softening. Their shoulders, usually squared, lowered unconsciously as their ears tuned in despite themselves. Victoria Whitmore's mask-like smile remained, but cracks began to form. The first piece could have been luck, a song from his childhood, something emotional but unpolished. But this was architecture, clean, disciplined, undeniable. End with each precise note. The possibility she had feared became harder to suppress. He's better than a professional. The word she had thrown so carelessly. If you can play better than a professional, I'll marry you now, clanged in her mind like a warning bell. Marcus leaned into the development section, breaking the theme into fragments, turning them, reassembling them, building toward a quiet storm. His tempo never faltered. His hands moved with speed, but never with haste. He was not here to dazzle. He was here to prove. No, not even to prove. To be every phrase was measured, intentional. No showing off, no indulgence, just mastery, unfolding one note at a time. In the crescendo, he could have gone louder, could have crashed down with force, but he didn't. Instead, he held back, demonstrating that true control was not in the ability to be loud, but in the choice not to. It was restraint, not excess, that carried power, and the room felt it. By the time Marcus returned to the closing cadence, the audience had forgotten they were watching a janitor. They had forgotten the champagne stain, the dare, even the viral potential. All that remained was the sound of a sonata finishing on its own clean terms. Marcus released the final chord, lifted the pedal, and let the music settle into silence once more. This silence was different again, not fragile, not tentative. This silence was respect. Applause erupted instantly this time. Strong, full, unhesitant guests leaped to their feet. Entire rows stood, clapping hard enough to sting their palms. Phones rose like a forest of lights. Even those who had mocked him earlier now found themselves caught in the wave. Their laughter long since dried up, and at the center of it all, Marcus Reed remained seated. Steady, letting the applause wash past him as if it belonged not to him but to the music itself. David Chen lowered his chin, his voice carrying, just loud enough for those nearby and for a microphone or two to catch. "Professional standard," he said clearly, "at a very high level." The words landed like a signature on a contract. The room shifted again. Victoria's fingers clenched in her lap. She could feel the crowd's gaze flickering toward her once more. This time not with mockery, but with expectation. "He has met your condition," their eyes seemed to say. "Now will you keep your word?" The ground beneath her carefully scripted evening was slipping fast, and the storm outside these walls, the cameras, the headlines, the waiting world, was only beginning to gather. The applause was still shaking. The marble when the first voices rose again. Encore. Another one. Don't stop now. This time the calls weren't scattered. They grew louder, overlapping, carrying the weight of demand. The crowd no longer wanted a novelty. They wanted more of him. Victoria's pulse quickened. She tried to raise her mic, but the wave of voices surged over her. For the first time in her glittering career, she was no longer steering the room. PR at her side leaned in with a whisper. Let him play again, Victoria. If you cut this off now, it will look like fear. She pressed her thumb against the faint champagne stain on her gown, a nervous habit she barely noticed anymore. Fear. That was a word she did not allow herself. Yet, as she looked at Marcus sitting calm and steady before the Steinway, something inside her admitted it. She was afraid. Because if he saw it again, her words would lock around her wrist like iron. Marcus swiveled slightly on the bench, scanning the rows not for approval but for breath, for the living rhythm of the room. He found David Chen's eyes. The critic gave the smallest nod, a signal, not of encouragement, but of recognition. Marcus inhaled, then exhaled. He set his hands once more on the keys. The opening came sharp and fast, notes leaping like sparks. This was no gentle melody, no warm jazz, no structured sonata. This was a summit piece, one of those compositions pianists chose only when they wanted to test the limits of their own stamina and skill. His left hand drove an ostinato with mechanical steadiness. Smooth as a belt drive, his right hand cascaded rapid-fire runs across octaves, crossing over and under with fearless precision. The tempo pushed forward, relentless. Each leap demanded power. Each trill demanded control. Each passage risked collapse if his focus wavered. Even for a second, that it was not a piece meant to sound pretty, it was meant to prove. The crowd gasped as his fingers blurred. Some leaned forward, counting impossible sequences, watching for a mistake that never came. A young man in the back lowered his phone halfway. For once, the clip didn't matter. Watching was enough. The guard nearest the stage, the same one who had blocked Marcus earlier, now leaned unconsciously forward, his jaw slack, his eyes following every move. David Chen scribbled furiously. Extreme, technical demand. Double note passages clean. Octave leaps precise. Wrist rotation flawless. Pedal sparse but effective. He stopped writing halfway through. Words would only slow him down. He sat back, eyes wide, listening as though he were hearing a long-lost recording of a master. This is not just professional. This is rare. Posture never wavered. His shoulders remained low, his wrists loose, even as the storm of notes whipped around him. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't straining. He was in control. And that was what struck the audience most. The ease, the composure, the way the most difficult passages seemed to flow through him rather than be forced when the climax came. Marcus pushed to the edge of fortissimo, but again, he didn't break through. Instead, he turned aside gracefully, sliding into a gliss so smooth the hall seemed to tilt half a step forward. Then, with perfect clarity, he brought the phrase back home, a clean cadence, a boundary line, a final word spoken without shouting. Silence. Then eruption. The hall exploded with sound. Chairs clattered as people rose. Glasses chimed as they were abandoned onto tables. A forest of phones lifted high. The ovation was no longer polite, no longer hesitant. It was thunder, unified and fierce. Marcus, bravo, Juan Mordi. Even the security guards clapped awkwardly at first. Then, with genuine force, David Chen stood slowly, giving his applause weight. He spoke clearly, his words chosen like notes in a chord at a very high professional level. He declared, without question. The sentence landed like a stamp of authenticity. The room roared louder, bowed his head. Humble. Then turned his eyes toward Victoria. And in that gaze, she felt every camera swing toward her. You said the words, the gaze reminded her. Now they are waiting. Her chest tightened. She raised the mic, her smile fixed but thin. Thank you for, she began, but the crowd cut her off. Keep your word, a voice shouted. Others joined. You promised to keep it. The gala she had built so carefully was no longer hers to control. It now belonged to a man in a navy shirt, seated at a piano who had reminded the world of his name, Marcus Reed. The ovation had barely faded when the shouts began. You said you'd marry. To him, keep your word. Don't back out now. The calls cut through the air sharper than applause. They weren't just demands, they were verdicts. Victoria Whitmore stood at the center of it, her gown heavy, her polished smile trembling at the edges. She felt 1,000 eyes pressing against her skin, and behind them 1,000 cameras, recording every blink. Her phone buzzed furiously in her clutch. She didn't need to check it to know what the messages said. Shareholders, lawyers, PR staff, all of them warning, do not confirm marriage, do not make binding statements. Stay neutral. But neutrality was no longer an option. Marcus rose slowly from the bench, his movements calm, unhurried. He didn't walk toward the microphone. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Victoria, steady as stone. He didn't need to say it aloud. His gaze spoke. You promised. They all heard you. The weight of her own words closed around her, like a lock. Gloria Johnson pressed a tissue to her lips, whispering, "Oh Lord." She had worked long enough to know how these moments usually ended, with excuses, evasions, polished phrases. She prayed this one would be different. David Chen remained standing, his presence like an official seal. His critics' authority wasn't just about music tonight. His words could sway headlines, shape narratives, cement truth. And he was waiting. The room stilled, waiting to dot. Victoria lifted the mic, her hands tight around it. Her voice, usually smooth as glass, trembled, just slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "let's not forget this is a gala for no." Someone shouted, "Don't change the subject." Applause broke into chants. "Keep your word, keep your word." The noise surged, drowning her voice. For the first time in years, she wasn't the conductor of the room, she was being conducted by it. Marcus finally spoke, his tone calm but clear, carrying even without a microphone. "I don't need a wedding," he said. "What I need is for words spoken in this room to mean something." The crowd quieted, just enough to listen. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through with honesty that microphones couldn't amplify. "If promises here can be laughed off as jokes," Marcus continued, "then what do they mean to anyone? To the people who clean these floors, to the ones who keep the light shining, to the hands that go unseen. Words should carry weight for everyone." His words didn't accuse, they invited, and that made them heavier. David Chen gave a small nod, as though stamping a document. "He's not asking for marriage," he said aloud. "He's asking for accountability." The sentence reframed the entire room. Laughter died, phones steadied. Now recording not a scandal but a statement. Victoria's chest rose and fell. She wanted to retreat into PR language, to buy herself an escape hatch of smooth phrases. If anyone was offended, it was only a figure of speech. But when she looked around, she saw faces, not polished donors, not glittering gowns, but people. People waiting, people listening. And she realized tonight wasn't about control. It was about truth. Gloria whispered again, stronger this time, "Call him by his name. That's where you start." Victoria looked at Marcus. For the first time all evening, she saw not a staff uniform, not a mistake to be corrected, not a problem to be managed, but a man. Her throat tightened. The mic shook in her hands. She drew a breath. "Marcus Reed," she said, his name falling into the microphone like a stone into a pond. The room shifted. Every phone captured it. Every ear heard it. Every person knew. This was no longer spectacle. This was the beginning of something binding. And outside the doors of the grand hall, reporters pressed closer, their cameras ready, their headlines half-written. The storm was waiting. The name still hung in the air. Marcus Reed. Spoken not as a label on a badge, not as a passing buddy, but as a name, a full name, a recognition. The crowd rippled with murmurs, carrying it from row to row, as if passing along. A rediscovered truth. Marcus Reed. Marcus Reed. And then, almost on cue, the storm outside broke in. Had the great doors of the Whitmore Grand. Security braced as reporters pressed forward, cameras flashing like lightning, voices rising like thunder. "Is it true? You're really marrying him? Who is Marcus Reed? Why was he cleaning floors when he plays like that?" Phones buzzed in every corner of the hall. The screens lit up with push notifications. One headline already blazed across feeds. "Arrogant heiress mocks janitor. He plays like a genius." Beneath it, #Marcus Reed, #keep your word, #Whitmore Grand. The internet was moving faster than the chandelier light. Gloria Johnson saw staff exchanging glances at the edges of the room. Their faces were alive with something she hadn't seen in years. "Pride," she whispered. "They'll never be invisible again. Not after this." Marcus remained calm, hands loose at his sides, eyes steady. He wasn't chasing the headlines, wasn't scanning the phones. He was watching Victoria because he knew this was the moment her world and his collided. David Chen scribbled one last note in his pad, identity revealed in real time. Then he stopped writing. Even for him, there were moments where ink was too small a container. Victoria's phone buzzed in her palm. She glanced down. "Investor, do not confirm marriage. Damage control now. Legal, all statements must be neutral. Use careful language. PR director pivot. Highlight hidden talent. Make this about discovery." Her pulse hammered. Discovery. That was the easy road. She could reframe this as a heartwarming gala twist. She could package Marcus into a story of luck, spin the night into a triumph of her brand. But deep inside, a quieter voice asked, wouldn't that be another theft? Another way of making him invisible, even in plain sight? Then came the voice that silenced her doubts. A woman near the back, silver-haired glasses slipping down her nose, rose slowly to her feet. "I know him," she said, her voice firm despite its age. "That's Marcus Reed. He played at the City Theater when he was 22. Heads turned. The ripple of recognition spread like a current. Yes, a man in gold-rimmed frames nodded. "I remember." The music press called him a prodigy, a rising star. Phones lit up again. Searches flew across the internet. Within moments, old photos appeared on screens, a young Marcus in a black suit, bowing beside a Steinway. His name printed in reviews. The truth was surfacing. Gloria's hands trembled as she pressed a tissue to her lips. She whispered, almost to herself, "They'll know now. They'll finally know." David Chen narrowed his eyes. Memory flickered. He remembered reading a review of a student named Marcus Reed, praised for his deep touch, his control, His ear. Yes, he thought. It's him. The crowd buzzed with questions. If he was a prodigy, why is he a janitor? What happened to him? Why didn't anyone know? The spotlight, once Victoria's by birthright, now belonged entirely to Marcus, not just for the music he had played tonight, but for the story that was unfolding around him. Victoria's throat tightened. Her mind raced. If this turned into a story of forgotten genius mocked by privilege, then every eye would swing back to judge her, not just for a cruel dare but for years of blindness. PR leaned close, whispering frantically, "Frame this as redemption. Say you discovered him. Say this is about talent hidden in plain sight." Victoria looked up. Her mask-click smile trembled. For the first time that night, she asked herself a question she had avoided her whole life. Am I here to win, or to do what is right? And across the room, Marcus simply waited, not demanding, not pushing, not even asking. Just waiting. Steady, as though the silence he had carved with music had given her space to make her own choice. The crowd buzzed like a restless hive, phones flashing, questions spilling over one another. Why was he a janitor? What that happened to him? Why did the world forget Marcus Reed? The spotlight turned not only on Marcus but on the silence surrounding his story. Gloria Johnson, clutching her tissues in both hands, felt her chest ache. She had waited years of watching him mop floors while others played pianos he deserved. Years of biting her tongue as whispers turned him into just staff. Her heart pounded as she stepped forward. Because no one gave him a chance to be anything else, she said, her voice rising clearer than she expected. The hall stilled, heads turned. Gloria stood straighter, as though pulled upright by truth itself. I've worked alongside this man for nearly a decade, she continued, and every night when the halls were empty, I heard him play. Not just songs but pieces with more soul than the concerts people here pay fortunes to attend. She pressed her tissue against her eyes, steadied herself and raised her chin. But years ago, when Marcus was just starting, doors closed on him, not because of his music but because of the skin he wore and the pockets he didn't line. They called him difficult when he refused to bow. They called him unreliable when he asked for dignity. And when he stopped playing, no one asked why. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some lowered their phones. Ashamed, Victoria felt her throat tighten. The words cut through her carefully polished narratives like knives. She had built a life on doors that opened at her knock, contracts that bent to her name. To imagine them slamming shut on someone like Marcus, someone who had played like that tonight, was unbearable. For the first time in years, she wanted not to defend herself but to listen. A man in the second row frowned deeply. "But I read about him once." The reviews were glowing. Gloria nodded, her voice trembling but strong. But glowing reviews can't feed you when halls refuse to book you. Praise can't shelter you when contracts evaporate. Marcus, that was praised but not sustained, applauded but not supported, and so he kept his dignity by working anywhere, anyhow, even here. Her words hung like heavy bells in the silence. David Chen lowered his pen, his critic's heart swelling with something deeper than analysis. He had spent years dissecting phrasing, articulation, intent. But tonight wasn't about theory. It was about witness. He spoke, his voice low but firm. "I can confirm. I remember those reviews. The boy with the touch beyond his years. That was Marcus Reed." Gasps again. Confirmation. Marcus stood steady, hands still at his sides. He hadn't asked Gloria to speak, hadn't demanded anyone carry his story, but hearing it, he gave the faintest nod, not of pride, but of gratitude. Gloria's knees trembled as she finished. "So don't ask why he was here with a mop in his hand. Ask why the world left a piano empty." Her tissue tore in her hand, but her back stayed straight. The hall was no longer restless. It was reverent. The crowd had no quick jokes left, no clever headlines. They had only the weight of what they had just learned. Victoria swallowed hard. Her PR director tugged her sleeve, whispering frantically, "Say something, pivot, spin it back to the gala." But she couldn't. Not now. The words Gloria had spoken weren't the kind that could be wallpapered over. Victoria's lips parted. For the first time in her career, she had no script. And Marcus, still calm, still steady, finally spoke. "I didn't come here tonight for pity," he said. "I came to work, same as always. I picked up a mop because it was honest work. And when I sat at that piano, I played not for promises or headlines. I played because music is what I was made for." His eyes swept the room, that's all. Simple, clear, undeniable. That silence after his words was thicker than applause. It wasn't the silence of doubt anymore. It was the silence of reckoning. And outside the grand doors, the storm of cameras surged harder. The world was listening now. The silence inside the hall was still deep, heavy. When the great oak doors groaned open, at first it was only a trickle, a flash of light, a ripple of voices. Then the storm rushed in. Reporters poured forward, cameras hoisted high, microphones thrust out like spears. Marcus Reed, can we get a statement? Victoria, are you keeping your word? Why was a man of this talent mopping floors? Is this discrimination? Is this redemption? Is this a scandal?" The room fractured. Some guests shrank back into corners, clutching their champagne glasses as if the storm might sweep them away. Others leaned eagerly toward the frenzy, hoping to capture a headline on their phones. The controlled elegance of the gala dissolved in seconds into something raw, unpredictable. Gloria Johnson stood rooted, tissues trembling in her hand. She had feared this, that truth, once spoken, would not be handled with care but devoured by headlines. She whispered, "Please, Marcus, choose carefully." David Chen pushed his way through the sea of microphones, his notepad shielded against the surge. His critics' instinct knew this was the moment that would decide whether Marcus was remembered as a viral spectacle or as the artist he truly was. He shouted above the noise, "Let him speak." The crowd quieted just enough for one voice to break through. Marcus stood steady, as if the flood of lights and cameras meant nothing more than another ripple of sound. "I will say this once," he said, his voice calm but clear. "I am not a scandal. I am not a stunt. I am not a dare. My name is Marcus Reed, and I am a pianist." The microphones thrust closer, the cameras blinked faster. "Why were you mopping floors?" a reporter demanded. Marcus met the question without flinching, "Because it was honest work. Work that needed doing. It fed me when music could not." The room stilled again, the simplicity of the answer cutting sharper than any headline. Victoria stood frozen in her glittering gown. Her PR team pushed a microphone toward her hand, mouthing instructions, "Spin it now." But for the first time in her career, her hands refused to move. She heard her own words echo in her mind. "If you can play better than a professional, I'll marry you." And she realized the storm was no longer about a joke gone wrong. It was about truth that could no longer be ignored. Gloria took a step forward, her voice trembling but strong enough to carry. "This man doesn't need your pity," she said. "He needs what was denied him. Recognition." David Chen lifted his chin, adding weight. "I will state it plainly. For the record, Marcus Reed plays at a very high professional level. Tonight, he proved it beyond question." His voice, crisp and authoritative, cut through the chaos like a gavel striking wood. The reporters surged again. "Marcus, what's next for you? Will you perform publicly again? Will you accept Victoria's promise?" The last question landed hardest. All cameras swung to Marcus, then to Victoria. The heiress stood rigid, her mask cracked, her voice caught in her throat. The crowd held its breath. Marcus turned toward her for a moment. The hall was silent again, not with chaos, not with judgment, but with anticipation. Would he claim her words as binding? Would he demand the spectacle the world now expected? Marcus spoke slowly, carefully, as though placing each note of a melody. "I don't need a promise of marriage," he said. "What I need is a promise of respect, not just for me but for everyone who has been made invisible, mocked, or dismissed." He let the words hang. Cameras clicked, guests shifted. It wasn't a scandal anymore. It was a statement. The storm outside had broken in, but Marcus had turned it into something else, a stage. And the world was listening. The storm of reporters still buzzed, but beneath the chaos, a new thread began to form. A woman in a crisp navy suit, headset still around her neck, pushed through the crowd of microphones. She carried the calm of someone used to commanding stages larger than this hall. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice clear but respectful. Lydia Barnes, senior producer for the Horizon Hour. We broadcast live to millions. If you're willing, we'd like to feature you, your music, your story, on tomorrow night's show." The room shifted. Guests leaned in, phones angled higher. A janitor, ignored for years, was being offered prime time. Marcus blinked, steady but surprised. He hadn't played tonight for opportunities. He had played because music was the truest thing he owned. Yet here it was, a door opening that he had once believed locked forever. He didn't answer immediately. His silence wasn't hesitation. It was discernment. David Chen's eyes lit behind his glasses. He knew this was the moment that could transform Marcus from a headline into a legacy, but it was also the moment where Marcus could be consumed by spectacle if he wasn't careful. Chen spoke softly, leaning close. "Take it, Marcus, but make sure it's on your terms." Victoria's stomach twisted. Every camera was watching, waiting to see whether she would support him or shrink back. Her PR team hissed at her in frantic whispers. "Distance yourself. This is risky. Don't tie your name to him. Spin this as discovery, but don't commit." But the voices in her ear no longer felt like anchors. They felt like chains. For the first time, she saw Marcus not as a pawn in her world, but as someone whose quiet dignity had outshone every chandelier in the room. And she wondered, what if standing with him is the only right thing left to do? Gloria's eyes brimmed with tears. She clasped her tissue to her chest and whispered, "Say yes, Marcus. The world needs to hear you." The hall waited. Marcus finally raised his head. "If I play," he said slowly, "it won't be as a curiosity. It won't be as a joke. It will be as who I am, a pianist, nothing less." Lydia Barnes smiled. "On your terms. That's the only way we'd want it." Her tone carried no trace of condescension. It was an offer, not a leash. Applause rose, again, softer but full of weight. Guests murmured, some clapping, some nodding. Even those who had mocked him earlier now seemed to grasp that they were standing in the shadow of a turning point. Victoria stepped forward. Her heels clicked against the marble, her gown trailing like spilled starlight. She lifted her microphone, her hands trembling only slightly. "For the record," she said, voice clear, "Marcus Reed has not been discovered tonight. He has been restored. His gift was always here. We were the ones who didn't see it." The words stunned even her PR team. Phones erupted, capturing every syllable. The room hummed with approval, murmurs swelling into applause. For the first time in her life, Victoria wasn't performing, she was confessing. Marcus inclined his head, not a bow, not gratitude for her words, just acknowledgement. The choice to speak had been hers, and the storm outside grew louder. Headlines flashed across feeds. Within minutes, forgotten prodigy steps back into light. Eris admits, "We failed to see him, Marcus Reed, to perform on Horizon Hour." "David," Chen whispered into his recorder, as if for history itself, "tonight we witnessed not just music but restoration." And Marcus, steady as ever, felt something he hadn't in years. Not applause, not recognition, but possibility. A door had opened. The question was, would he walk through it? The gala had dissolved into chaos. Reporters herded out guests, scattering, phones still glowing as they hurried to post. The chandeliers dimmed, and staff began clearing tables littered with glasses and napkins. But in one small corner of the grand hall, Marcus sat alone at the Steinway. His hands rested on his lap. The keys before him gleamed like untouched snow. For the first time that night, he felt the weight of what had happened pressing down. Not the applause, not the cameras, but the choice that lay ahead. A televised performance. A return he had been offered, the very thing he once dreamed of, and the very thing that had once broken him. The hall was nearly empty when Gloria approached. She carried her small purse in one hand, tissues in the other. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as though afraid to break the fragile silence. "You played like you were born for it," she said softly. Marcus didn't look up. "Playing is easy. Living with what follows, that's harder." Gloria sat on the bench beside him, her frame small against the great piano. "You're afraid of being forgotten again." He shook his head. "Not forgotten. Used, shown off when it's convenient, ignored when it isn't. I've lived that. I don't know if I can again." Gloria folded her hands in her lap. "Marcus, you've spent years hiding your light because the world dimmed it once. But tonight, that light broke through anyway. You didn't play to impress them, you played because you had to. That's the truth. And truth is stronger than fear." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded clipping. Yellowed with age, she pressed it into his hand. It was an old review, the one that had once called him a pianist, with touch beyond his years. "I kept this," she whispered, "not because you needed reminding, but because I did. Because I needed proof that what I heard in those empty halls was real." Her voice trembled. "The world is asking you to remind them now, not for their sake, for yours." Marcus studied the paper. The words blurred slightly as his eyes stung. He remembered those nights standing at the edge of promise, only to have contracts vanish, calls unanswered, doors slammed. He remembered leaving rehearsal halls with pockets empty, pride intact but brittle. He remembered the sting of knowing talent was not always enough. And yet, he also remembered tonight. The silence before the first note, the shift in the room, the sound of his name spoken aloud. He had not been invisible anymore. "Do you think they'll listen this time?" he asked quietly. Gloria placed her small, weathered hand over his. "They already are." Her hand trembled, but her words did not. "And even if they don't, Marcus, even if the world shuts its doors again, you will know you stood up once more. You will know you didn't let them bury you." For the first time in years, Marcus allowed himself to breathe deeply, not the shallow breath of survival, but the kind that reached his lungs fully. Like fresh air after rain, his gaze shifted back to the keys. He lowered one finger, pressing a single note, letting it ring in the empty hall. It was soft, but it filled the silence. Gloria smiled faintly. "That's the sound of tomorrow, Marcus." Outside the Whitmore Grand, cameras still flashed, headlines multiplied, hashtags grew. But inside, in that quiet hall, it was just a man, a piano, and a friend who believed. The decision wasn't easy. The past still haunted, but Marcus Reed knew this much. He would not let fear be the only note left unsung. The morning light crept into Marcus's small apartment, filtering through blinds onto the worn surface of his upright piano. He hadn't touched it yet. Instead, he sat at his small kitchen table. The old newspaper clipping Gloria had given him spread before him like a map of a road he thought he'd left behind. The knock at the door came precisely at 9. Lydia Barnes stood there, still in her sharp navy suit, clipboard in one hand, headset dangling from the other. Behind her, a cameraman waited respectfully by the stairs. "Mr. Reed," she said, her tone professional but warm. "The office stands. A full segment on the Horizon Hour. We'll broadcast your performance live. Millions will hear you." Marcus studied her face. He saw no mockery there, no hunger to sensationalize. Still, he spoke carefully. "If I play, it must be on my terms. No tricks, no staging, no story twisted into pity. The music speaks for itself. If that's not what you want, then I'll decline. Lydia didn't hesitate. That's exactly what we want. Pure, honest performance. We'll frame it as your return, not as a novelty. Her confidence was steady, but her respect was deeper. She wasn't treating him as fragile or sensational. She was treating him as an artist. Marcus gave a slow nod. Then I'll do it. Gloria, who had insisted on being present, clasped her hands together with relief. The world will finally hear you, she whispered. Lydia smiled faintly. The world already has. Now it just needs reminding. Across the city. Meanwhile, Victoria Whitmore sat in her penthouse office. The morning papers spread before her like scattered pieces of glass. Heiress mocked janitor, exposed on stage. Whitmore gala overshadowed by forgotten genius. Victoria's dare backfires. Public demands accountability. Her PR team circled like anxious bees, drafting statements, planning interviews, spinning narratives. But for once, their chatter sounded hollow. Victoria stared at her reflection in the floor-to-sea window. The mask she wore at galas, the perfect smile, the effortless control. It all felt like brittle porcelain. The truth was written plainly in every headline. She had mocked what she did not understand. Her phone buzzed again. A message from her. Father terse as ever. Fix this. The Whitmore name cannot afford weakness. She exhaled shakily. Weakness. That was the word she had spent her whole life running from. But last night, when Marcus's music filled the hall, she hadn't felt weak. She had felt small. Small and humbled and shaken in a way that no amount of wealth could steady. For the first time, she wondered, maybe weakness isn't the worst thing. Maybe blindness is. Back at his apartment, Marcus opened the lid of his upright piano. The keys were worn, some chipped, but his fingers rested on them with the ease of an old friendship. He began to play softly, not the storm of last night, not the disciplined sonata, but something gentle, like a voice waking after years of silence. Gloria listened from the kitchen, her tissues clutched tight, tears slipping freely. She had prayed for this moment for years. Each note carried a promise. Marcus Reed was returning, not because the world demanded it, but because he had chosen it on social media. The announcement spread within hours. Marcus Reed to perform live on the Horizon Hour tomorrow night. The world held its breath. And somewhere in her penthouse, Victoria closed the papers, pressed her palms to her desk, and whispered, "Then I'll be there, no matter what they say." For once, it wasn't about control. It was about something she wasn't sure she had ever truly known before. Responsibility. The upright piano in Marcus's apartment creaked faintly as he lifted its lid again. Morning light slanted across the keys, pale and quiet compared to the grandeur of the Steinway he had commanded the night before. He placed his hands on the keyboard, but this time the notes didn't come easily. His fingers faltered, slipping on passages he had once commanded effortlessly. Each mistake pulled him back into memories he'd tried to bury. Competition judges frowning, contracts vanishing, whispered excuses, not marketable, not the right fit, not reliable. He closed the lid abruptly, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. His breath was unsteady. Gloria, sitting nearby with her ever-present tissues, spoke gently. "Marcus, it's not about being flawless, it's about being true." He gave a low, almost bitter laugh. "The world doesn't tune in for truth, Gloria. It tunes in for perfection. And the last time I tried to give them that, it broke me." Her small hand reached across, covering his. "Then don't give them perfection. Give them you." That's what shook that hall last night. That's what they couldn't turn away from. Marcus lifted his eyes. He wanted to believe her, but fear had claws. Across the city, Victoria Whitmore sat under the glare of studio lights. An interviewer leaned forward, microphone angled like a spotlight. "Miss Whitmore, you promised on stage to marry Marcus Reed if he outplayed a professional pianist. Last night, David Chen himself declared Mr. Reed's performance was of a very high professional level. Are you keeping your word?" Victoria's pulse raced. Her PR team had rehearsed answers with her all morning, safe, neutral lines. It was only a playful remark. "The gala is about charity. Let's focus on the bigger picture." But when she opened her mouth, the words caught. She remembered the look on Marcus's face as he spoke. "I don't need a wedding. I need words to mean something." Her voice trembled slightly, but she forced it steady. "I will not make a joke of a man's dignity," she said. "Marriage is not a prize, but yes, my words carry weight, and I intend to show Mr. Reed the respect he deserves." The studio stilled. It wasn't the scripted answer, it wasn't polished, but it was human, and that ironically made it headline-worthy by evening. The internet hummed with two parallel stories. Marcus Reed, forgotten prodigy, prepares for return. Victoria Whitmore, heiress, confronts her words. One was about music, the other about accountability. And together, they were setting the stage for something larger than either of them alone. In his apartment, Marcus finally lifted the piano lid once more. He pressed a single note, then another. Slowly a melody emerged, halting at first, then steady, then strong. He wasn't chasing perfection anymore. He was reclaiming his voice. And tomorrow night, the world would hear it. The evening before the broadcast, Marcus sat at his upright piano, the room lit only by a small lamp. Sheet music lay scattered across the floor. Pages curled and yellowed at the edges. Bach, Chopin, Gershwin, Rachmaninoff. Each piece called to him, yet none felt right. He pressed his forehead against his knuckles. What do I play? It wasn't about impressing anymore. It wasn't about dazzling with speed or discipline. It was about truth. Gloria watched him from the doorway, her hands folded around her tissues. She spoke gently. Play what speaks to your story, Marcus, not what they expect, what you need to say. Marcus looked at her, then at the worn keys. His fingers hovered, then pressed softly into a melody he hadn't touched in years, a piece his mother used to hum while cooking, back when the world felt possible. Simple, pure, a lullaby woven into classical form. The music drifted into the air, unpretentious but full of heart. Gloria's eyes filled. That's it. Marcus closed his eyes. He knew she was right. He had found the piece. Not a display of perfection, but a confession in sound. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria Whitmore stood in her father's towering office, the city's skyline burning orange in the evening light. George Whitmore, silver-haired and iron, didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to crush most rooms into silence. You've embarrassed this family, he said, each word clipped. Your name trends with scandal. Do you understand what that means for the Whitmore brand? Victoria's throat tightened. I fix it. Distance yourself from that man. Issue a statement. Call it a misunderstanding. Her fists curled at her sides. He's not that man. His name is Marcus Reed. Her father's eyes narrowed. Marcus Reed is nobody, a janitor who stumbled onto a stage. Did not tie on to as Victoria felt something burn inside her, anger, shame, defiance all at once. For years she had obeyed, sculpted herself into the P. Victoria left the office, her heels clicking against marble floors. For the first time in her life she wasn't sure whether she was stepping into ruin or into freedom, but she knew one thing. This time she would not be silent, and across the city Marcus pressed the last note of his chosen piece, letting it fade into the night air. Tomorrow it would no longer belong to him alone. Tomorrow the world would hear it. The television lights shone like a sunrise. The studio was filled with quiet anticipation. Millions were watching from living rooms, phones, and screens across the globe. Marcus Reed sat at the grand piano, his posture calm, his breath steady. He had faced storms before. He had been broken before, but tonight he was whole. He lifted his hands and began to play. The melody was simple, unpretentious, a lullaby turned into something timeless. Each note carried not perfection, but truth, the kind of truth that slipped past words and found its way into the human heart. In the control booth, Lydia Barnes whispered to her team, "Don't cut away, let him finish." Every note. In the audience, Gloria pressed her tissues to her eyes, tears falling freely. She had prayed for this moment for years, and now it was here. Marcus was not invisible. The world was listening. And on the edge of the stage, Victoria Whitmore stood, not as a host, not as an heiress, not as a figure of control, but as a woman who had finally chosen humility over pride. She had stood against her father, against spin, against silence. And now, she stood beside Marcus. As the final note faded into the stillness, the studio erupted, applause thundered, reporters shouted questions, phones lit with headlines. Marcus Reed, the return of a forgotten prodigy. From janitor to genius, a story of dignity. Victoria Whitmore admits words must mean something. But Marcus didn't stand to chase applause. He bowed his head, quiet and steady, then rose. "I am not here for pity," he said into the microphone. "I am here because music belongs to everyone, to every child told they don't belong, to every worker made invisible, to everyone who has been mocked or dismissed. Let my story remind you, your worth does not disappear because the world fails to see it." The crowd fell silent, then erupted again, this time not for spectacle, but for truth. Later, when the cameras dimmed, Gloria hugged him with trembling arms. "You did it, Marcus. You gave them more than music. You gave them hope." Victoria stepped closer, her voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. "I mocked you once, but you restored me with your grace. I don't know if I can ever deserve your forgiveness, but I'll spend my life trying to live by the truth you showed tonight." Marcus looked at her steady. Calm. "Then let your words mean something. That's all I ask." In the weeks that followed, opportunities came. Concert halls opened their doors, invitations poured in. But Marcus chose carefully, refusing to be used as a headline. He performed where it mattered. Schools, communities, stages where forgotten voices could finally be heard. And every time he sat at the piano, he played not for fame, not for revenge, but for something deeper. Dignity, truth, and hope. A story of Marcus Reed became more than a scandal, more than a headline. It became a reminder whispered in classrooms, in boardrooms, in homes across the world. Your worth is not defined by the world's blindness. Your truth is not erased by its silence, and your song is never lost, only waiting to be played.